Well, the introduction having been completed, Paul now begins what is essentially his last written instructions uh, to young Timothy and also to the church at Ephesus and to the churches throughout the generations, as it turns out. And you and I benefit from these, what are his final words. Paul begins by giving Timothy a peek into the life that Paul sees in Timothy. Oftentimes, we bog down with our critics and begin to see all of the shortcomings that we have in our lives, and certainly our critics point those out. Satan likes to make us think we're useless. And from time to time, it behooves us to listen to people of faith, people who believe in us, people who believe in what God is doing, the purpose that He's called us to. And that's what Paul does in these first few verses of 2 Timothy. He takes this moment to encourage young Timothy, and in part encourage him because of what has already been witnessed. He knew that he would be executed soon. Yet we have to remember these words are written. He's in a Roman dungeon, probably a more of a pit or a cave where prisoners would be kept, chained, likely having a Roman guard on either side because he's on death row and he's waiting for his execution. Every time he hears footsteps coming in his direction, he has no way of knowing whether or not this would be his last moments. And so these are words that were written out of that circumstance, but he's writing to encourage Timothy, and encourage means to put courage in. He's wanting to put courage into the young pastor's life. Verse 3 says, "I thank God, whom I serve with clear conscience, as my forefathers did, when I constantly remember you in my prayers night and day." The circumstances of his life, nor the regiments of Roman soldiers that probably could be heard marching to and fro, could not rob the great apostle of the joy that he experienced in Christ. It is interesting that even on his death watch, his mind reflected to those that matter to him. It reflected to those who had gone before him, his ancestors in the faith, and those who were coming behind him, Timothy in particular. And even most likely those ancestors would have included those that invested in him even before his Damascus Road conversion. He knew God had a plan that was established from him from the beginning, and all that he'd experienced as a young, soon-to-be rabbi in the Jewish faith, learning the law, learning from the prophets, all of those things, when the conversion took place on the Damascus Road, that brought the Old Testament to life. It put everything in perspective, and Paul knew that God had established this plan for him. And he mentions on another occasions in Galatians chapter 1, verse 15 and 16, he said, "But when God, who from my mother's womb set me apart and called me by his grace, was pleased to reveal his Son so that I could preach him among the Gentiles." God always calls a man or a woman for such a time as this. And in Paul's case, he had been born in a well-to-do family. He'd been educated at the feet of Gamaliel. He was a theologian in training, but then he had his miraculous Damascus Road conversion. And that was able to bring the Old Testament scriptures to life through Calvary and the sacrifice of Christ. So as a result, the world, including you and me, owe a great deal of gratitude to the Apostle Paul. So he says, with a clear conscience, he refers to that integral part of his lifelong testimony. Paul's preaching was the same whether the audience was seated in an ornate and columned throne room, as would have been the case with Agrippa and Festus, or on the sandy shore of Ephesus, where he was saying goodbye to the elders as they got on their knees and thanked God for one another. In Acts 20, he used some of the same language as he defended himself and his ministry. And he concluded by reminding Timothy that he prays for him daily. Nothing Nothing is more significant than being on someone's prayer list. I'm very humbled and very grateful for the number of people in my life that on a daily basis have prayed for me, or from periodically have prayed for me, and I am grateful for every person who names me as they go before the Lord, and as we should, and all of us certainly should. He then says to Timothy, beginning in verse 4, he says, "Remembering your tears, I long to see you so that I may be filled with joy, clearly recalling your sincere faith that first lived in your grandmother Lois, then in your mother Eunice, and I am convinced is in you also. Therefore I remind you to keep ablaze the gift of God that is in you through the laying on of my hands. For God has not given us a spirit of fearfulness, but one of power, love, and sound judgment." One of Paul's desires, and likely one of his prayers, would have been that he would get to see Timothy again. Timothy's tears were probably the last thing Paul remembered when he left him in Macedonia, or when they parted ways in Macedonia. That had been on his mind. The obvious heartbroken because of separation, and we know here on earth that that is heartbreaking when we have to say goodbye to a loved one, whether in death or they move to another state or another country. That's always separation's always hard, and one of the things about heaven that we long for is there's no more separation. But the last thing Paul remembered about Timothy were his tears, and he probably often thought of Timothy and knew that the tears came from the separation. Maybe there was a hint of fear in Timothy's life. I remember when I surrendered the ministry, I was overwhelmed by the challenge that was before me. I knew I had a lot of people praying for me. I knew I had a lot of people in my corner. I knew a lot of people were supportive. I knew there were people I could go to for advice, but there was still that overwhelming sense that there's a responsibility ultimately going to fall on me. And even today, with communication as it is and how easy it is for us to be able to talk to those that have gone before us, Timothy would not have enjoyed that. When Paul was leaving Macedonia, Timothy probably had the thought in his mind, it's on me now, and I may never see Paul again. So Paul really did want to see Timothy again. Timothy surely would have known that Nero would eventually silence Paul. Paul was going to be imprisoned in Rome, and eventually Nero was going to execute Paul. Nero had it in for the Christian church and for the Christianity, and Paul was he was the leader. He was at the top of the ladder, and obviously now that he was in custody, Timothy must have known that Paul was going to eventually die because of his faith, and Paul was like a father to him, and so there was that heartache as well. Since the purpose of this last letter of Paul's was to strengthen the resolve of young Timothy, he begins by reminding him where he came from. He reminds him of his grandmother Lois and his mother Eunice, and the faith that they had and the faith that they passed on to Timothy. And he reminds Timothy, it's in you as well. And it would be paramount as the church would move into those post-apostolic years. They would not have Paul to look back to. Peter would be off the scenes. John had been exiled to Patmos. All the other apostles had been gone. Now it's going to fall to the Timothys and the others, the John Mark and others, who would have a role in advancing the kingdom and advancing the church. And they would be doing so in a world filled with hate and persecution toward the church. Just as Herod poured out his wrath on the infants in Bethlehem when Jesus was born, or shortly after Jesus was born, in hopes of stopping the Son of Man, the Caesars did everything that they could to stop the spread of the church. Satan is always trying to thwart the work of God. He does every time God begins to move. Even in our own church, we recognize that God's hand is on us, and God begins to move, and we see the results of God just doing the things that only God can do. We're not naive to think that Satan throws up his hands and says, "Oh, I'll surrender. God's got this one." No, that simply infuriates the enemy even more, and he does all that he can to stop the work of God. He counterfeits what God's doing, but it's always to no avail. I love the language in verse 6 that says, "Keep the spiritual gift aflame in you." Means that phrase means to stir the embers, that fire that's in you, to stir that. And you and I know, if you leave a fire to itself, it will eventually die out. Whether you heat by fire, you're sitting around the fire pit in the evening, you stir the embers, you add the wood. You have to keep the fire aflame, and that's what Paul's saying to Timothy in these words, and in particular in verse 6. "Therefore I remind you to keep ablaze the gift of God that's in you." Don't neglect the gift that God's given you. As a result of neglect, the fire will go out. It's just like a skilled and gifted athlete must constantly train and keep his body under submission. So too should one who is gifted by the Holy Spirit and trained to do the work. That word "stir up" is used only one time in the New Testament, and it is here. You may be familiar with Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament. The word is used one time in the Septuagint, and that is where the spirit of Jacob was ablaze when he learned that his son Joseph was alive. Remember, they'd sold Joseph into, his brothers had sold Joseph into slavery, and told his father that he had died. Then they would find out later that he was still alive. And when they told Jacob that his son Joseph was still alive, the Septuagint uses this word to describe how his spirit was suddenly lifted and set aflame. Satan and his minions thrive when men become intimidated or afraid. Paul simply reminding Timothy that this fear is not from God, that God has given us the power. What is inside of us is greater than all of these pressures and forces from the outside. But that doesn't mean Satan gives up. He is relentless, and he will continue to try to keep us captive by our own fear. I just finished reading a book by John Piper called "Risk is Right." And in that book, he tells the story of Germany in the 1930s as the church in Germany faced severe persecution because of the Nazi movement. The regime was determined to not only annihilate the Jews, but also to silence the church. And so the worldwide church was trying to respond to this bully, Hitler, and what was going on in Europe at the time. And then the plan, the ultimate plan, was to conquer that continent and eventually the world. And so as the Nazi regime began to persecute the church and to move forward with its plan, the worldwide church wanted to respond to that, wanted to condemn that activity, but they also didn't want to make it more difficult for the church in Germany. And so they chose to not be vocal in their condemnation. They chose to just stay on the sidelines. They would say, "We're praying for the church in Germany," but they didn't want to make it more difficult. So they thought silence was the answer. Dietrich Bonhoeffer criticized the worldwide church's position and said this, and I think it applies for all of us. I think it's a wonderful quote. He said, quote, "To delay or fail to make decisions may be more sinful than to make wrong decisions out of faith and love." He was saying to the church, doing nothing, making no decision, or being silent, that may be a greater sin than to speak out against Hitler, even if it made the ministry for the churches in Germany more difficult if they speak out with the right heart and with the right motives, that God will take care of that. God will honor that. And I think even today, you and I are living in a day where people just don't like risk. They want everything just to stay. And I would say that sometimes in our effort to keep from taking a risk, we have actually taken a greater risk. And I agree that the church is not to remain silent when God calls us to speak. We're not to remain unchanged when God calls us to change, to adjust, and to be all that He wants us to be. So he wants Timothy to be strong in his faith, the faith that's been in him since for generations, and he wants him to be able to lead going forward, because it is going to be up to Timothy and the others as the apostolic age comes to a close. Well, thank you for being a part tonight. I look forward to us continuing our study. We're getting closer to the final words of Paul, which are going to be encouraging to all of us. But he has much to say to us through his letter to young Timothy. I'll see you next Wednesday night.